Welcome to Called to the Bar, International Law over Drinks. I'm your host, Douglas Guilfoyle, Professor of International Law and Security at the University of New South Wales, Canberra. Today we are recording our first emergency Trump minicast following dramatic announcements on Tuesday. Was it really only Tuesday? That the US will take over and own Gaza, air quotes supplied, and all the Palestinians of Gaza could just be resettled somewhere else to live in peace and harmony. I am joined today to discuss these frankly brain-bending developments with our regular co-host, Dr. Juliette McIntyre of the University of South Australia, catching her between multiple media appearances. And before we begin, I remind everyone that in these informal conversations, we are, as always, speaking off the cuff and without benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. Now, before we get down to business, our traditional first question, Juliette, what's your drink? Look, frankly, I would much rather be having this discussion over Talisker around 9 p.m. at night, but it's 11 for me and 10:30 in the morning for you. What have you got?
Yeah, no, look, I'm having a nice long black iced Americano that I made in the office kitchen for myself, and did not add anything to. So yeah, I'm tackling today sober, which is an interesting choice. We'll see how long that lasts.
Well, indeed. Yeah, well, I'm the one with the Irish surname. So yes, making it Irish should be a possibility. Yeah, no, I'm just drinking mineral water. But tonight on my new health regime is one of the nights where I get to drink alcohol. So let's see how that goes for me. All right, now look, as proper researchers, we should always go to the primary source. So I've extracted some chunks from the Trump-Netanyahu press conference transcript. I am not going to attempt the voice. President Trump said, "I also strongly believe that the Gaza Strip, which has been a symbol of death and destruction for so many decades and so bad for the people anywhere near it, and especially those who live there and frankly, who's been really unlucky. It's been very unlucky. It's been an unlucky place for a long time. Being in its presence just has not been good, and it should not go through a process of rebuilding an occupation by the same people that have really stood there and fought for it and lived there and died there and lived a miserable existence there. Instead, we should go to other countries of interest with humanitarian hearts, and there are many of them that want to do this, and build various domains that will ultimately be occupied by the million Palestinians living in Gaza, ending the death and destruction and, frankly, bad luck. This can be paid for by neighbouring countries of great wealth. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 12. It could be numerous sites, or it could be one large one. But the people will be able to live in comfort and peace, and we'll make sure something really spectacular is done. They're going to have peace. They're not going to be shot at and killed and destroyed like this civilization of wonderful people has had to endure. The only reason the Palestinians want to go back to Gaza is they have no alternative. It's right now a demolition site. This is just a demolition site. Virtually every building is down. They're living under fallen concrete that's very dangerous and very precarious. They instead can occupy all of a beautiful area with homes and safety, and they can live out their lives in peace and harmony instead of having to go back and do it again. The US will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of all the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job. Do something different. We have an opportunity to do something that could be phenomenal, and I don't want to be cute. I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so magnificent. But more importantly than this is that people that have been absolutely destroyed that live there now can live in peace in a much better situation because they are living in hell. And those people will now be able to live in peace. We'll make sure that it's done world class. It will be wonderful for the people. Palestinians mostly we're talking about. And I have a feeling that despite them saying no, I have a feeling that the king in Jordan and the general, but that general in Egypt will open their hearts and give us the kind of land that we need to get this done. And people can live in harmony and peace. So Juliette, despite the fact that I never swear on this podcast and leave this to Tamsin, my first question to you is, what the fuck?
Oh my God. Oh my God. Like I'm just making Muppet noises. When I first saw, there's something so unhinged about hearing that in your voice too, right? Because the first time you hear it, you're just shocked. My jaw was on the floor and I could not articulate any words for a significant period of time when I first heard it. And then hearing a normal person say these words is just the complete insanity just becomes all the more apparent. Okay, so we'll get into the legal analysis in a minute because that's what we're here for. But what the fuck, right? Like this,
Right,
he
right. So
seems
I
to
mean,
be making it up as he goes. He's just
as
saying
I said
stuff.
to you in a phone call on the day in question, we've all had that one bad boss, right? We've all come in from a day at work and gone, oh my God, my crazy boss has had this harebrained scheme. They've just announced it off the top of their head. I can see 200 reasons why it won't work. And now they just expect us to drop everything and implement it. And the White House has just said, hold my beer.
Yeah. And what I think is concerning is the way that today, our time, the other elements of the administration are validating and progressing this idea. Like, rather than sort of saying, wow, that was just some random stuff he said off the top of his head that nobody had ever heard of before. You've got Marco Rubio down in Guantanamo going, yeah, this is a very generous offer, and it's a really good idea and we should do that. People seem to be taking it seriously. And it's actually a point I want to come back to because this is the place for detailed, nuanced arguments that I can't necessarily get across in the media. And one of the things I kind of want to say here is when head of states say things in press conferences, those things can have legal effects, right? Like they
Right.
can be considered to stop certain conduct, or they can be considered to be promises for certain obligations. So even though
And we can come back to this, confessions of mens rea.
yeah, that's right. So this is not an inconsequential, oh, he's just completely crazy. We can ignore this. He is a head of state, whether we like it or not. And so we cannot just dismiss this out of hand. And then, as I said, it doesn't seem like people are dismissing it out of hand in any event, right? The administration seems to be going, oh, okay, so he said this, so let's
Well,
progress forward with this.
2 points on that. One, it goes back to my sort of theory of the bad boss effect, right? Leaders get used to kind of saying, or can come unhinged from reality because they'll say things like, and Trump was a real estate developer, and a lot of this sounds like a real estate deal in his imagining, but put a building over there and it goes up. Bad leaders start to mistake their ideas for implementable reality because it's happened in the past. And also, how long does anyone who said no to Trump keep their job? I mean,
Yeah.
I think, the unit of time of approximately 11 days, the one standard Scaramucci, is, named for Trump's propensity to fire people.
Yeah, exactly. So it's clear that there's going to be a bunch of people now who are genuinely trying to make this reality in some way or another. That's not to say it's even slightly feasible, right? Like we can come to that as well. But yeah, that's I think my initial reaction was we need to take this seriously and not just dismiss it out of hand.
Right.
So yeah.
So, what questions have been put to you by the media, and what responses have you been able to give, and what responses would you have liked to have given at greater length?
Yeah, so one of the main ones seems to be this, I guess, confusion or this question of what is ethnic cleansing, right? Because that seems to be the phrase that a lot of people are choosing to use about this idea that you would just put 2.3 million Palestinians somewhere else.
Right.
And so one of the things that I think needs to be made really clear is that while ethnic cleansing is what I might call a political term,
Yeah.
it's not an official legal crime. It doesn't have any distinct definition. That doesn't mean that the activities that constitute ethnic cleansing aren't unlawful.
Right.
So the
Or
state
indeed criminal.
or decriminal. That's right. So I think that's the first point is that this phrase, and I don't know whether it's being used just due to maybe a lack of understanding about what the legalities are, or whether it's being used as a deliberate sort of attempt to not cover up what might be happening, but to I don't know. I mean, ethnic cleansing sounds bad, right? Like I don't think anyone reads that phrase and thinks, "Oh, that's a great idea."
So
But
if I
yeah,
could come in on that, I mean, I think where ethnic cleansing comes from, and this goes to kind of popular understandings of international law, and people like Maddie Chiam have written really extensively and persuasively on this, but certain ideas kind of get picked up in the popular consciousness, and there's that increasing, I think, at least in the West, inability to kind of distinguish, what is bad policy or what is immoral from what is illegal. And in a sense, legality has subsumed questions of morality or wisdom. Okay,
yes,
so our go-to say something is bad is to try and label it as illegal. Now, I think ethnic cleansing kind of got locked into the political and journalistic discourse by the atrocities during the wars of dissolution of the former federal state of Yugoslavia, right? Before we had the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, we had ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
Then when the ICTY was set up, it was set up with a pretty skeletal statute that referred to grave breaches of the laws and customs of war and crimes against humanity. And honestly, its jurisprudence had to fill a lot of that out. So the war crime or crime against humanity, if it's not attached to an active conflict, is essentially the same crime. It's called deportation or forcible transfer. And it does what it says on the tin. If it's deportation, you are forcibly moving people across a border. If it's forcible transfer, you are forcibly moving people within a border, potentially to reshape ethnic populations. But it doesn't have to be done on an ethnic discriminatory basis, right? That's not a prerequisite. So ethnic cleansing is essentially a journalistic phrase. It also, I think, muddies the line between war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, because you could come up with different ethnic cleansing scenarios that would fit any of those. So if you forcibly deported someone over a border, or a population over a border, to a place where the conditions of life couldn't sustain them, you would thereby be, intentionally inflicting conditions of life on them calculated to bring about their destruction. And if you were doing that intentionally, with the intent to destroy them as a distinct protected group, that would be genocide. Yeah. So ethnic cleansing, I think, is essentially a sort of historical journalistic label, but it got baked in the 90s and carried forward, even though it doesn't correspond to one precise legal concept.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And I mean, yeah, like the context matters here as well. For starters, forcible transfer / deportation, just a crime. Like, and I've been asked things like, oh, well, it might only be temporary, is that okay? And I was like, no, no, it's really not. I mean, for starters, it wouldn't be temporary. We can all see the reality of that. If in some hopefully completely alternate universe this was to actually happen. But
I mean, you can legally temporarily displace a civilian population during an armed conflict that's ongoing for their own safety. That's like the only carve out. And even then that's obviously subject to abuse.
Yeah, precisely. And it's clear that that's not what is going on here, And it's difficult to critique the legal details of a plan that has no detail. What you said at the start of this episode is pretty much all the information that we have. And so anyone who wants to really pass, oh, would this be legal? Would this not be legal? Is, well, no. Like, the answer is no, okay?
Right.
We cannot sort of get into any details about a project that has no details. I tried at one point to think through a way in which the Palestinians, were they to be exercising their right to self-determination, might come up with a version of this plan. They wouldn't, obviously, because this is their homeland and this is, they want to live in their land. But again,
so this is category of violations number 2, right?
Yeah.
Like this plan is also very essentially, very obviously, a denial of self-determination.
Precisely.
Right? You are saying no, these people who are, a self-determination unit with this territory. Well, frankly, I mean, they're already a state, as we've discussed in previous episodes. Presuming they had not yet achieved statehood and were a self-determination unit, you are depriving them of the choice of what future status the territory will have. And it's also an act of self-determination, I guess, for a population of an existing state or territory to determine what future relationship or configuration they'll have with other states. You're taking all of that away. Which again goes to a sort of a running theme from season 1 of Call to the Bar, that our textbooks told us self-determination was an issue of the past, and it just keeps coming back on the agenda.
Absolutely, and it's, look, the analogy I was thinking of is, many do not know that there's a weird clause in the Australian Constitution that allows New Zealand to decide to become a state of Australia should they so choose. And so in that kind of a world where all of New Zealand suddenly, holds a referendum and decides to become a part of Australia, can a population decide to join another state when everyone's consenting? Yeah, sure, they can. But
the territory usually goes with them.
The territory goes with them. That's right. That's my next point, right? So this other thing is the annexation, the clear plan to annex this territory.
Ding, ding. New international law violation, like annexation by force. And he said, we'll put US troops in if necessary, or frankly, the forces already being used to establish control by Israel. Annexation of territory by force is, boys and girls, the crime of aggression.
Yes.
Like this is, there is nothing fuzzy about this. This is sparkling appellation contrôlée aggression. if it goes through, which is both a violation of the UN Charter and a crime of individual responsibility.
Yeah, 100%. And so that's the thing that's so extraordinary is, look, it's not like annexation hasn't been attempted in the recent past, like Russia, Crimea, and the other parts of Ukraine, like
Israel and the Golan Heights.
Israel and the Golan Heights, right? That really blatantly obvious attempts at this. But I think what is so jarring here is to have it casually announced.
Right.
And by the supposed leader of the free world. I mean, I despise that phrase, but it is, of course, very popular. And it's how a lot of Western countries view the United States.
And this goes to my mens rea point, right? We can say all of these things could be crimes, but the usual problem in international criminal law is proving that leaders knew, leaders were in control of the plan, and leaders had the relevant mens rea. It's very rare that a head of state announces criminal mens rea in advance to the world in a press conference.
Precisely. And so this is the thing that's really, I think, honest. I mean, it's not like, and the US itself has committed plenty of violations of international law too, right? So it's not like the US has this amazing track record. But I think, and that's been mentioned.
Sorry, I hear Tamsin yelling from outside the podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's and I've had people say that to me almost in a, I don't know, strangely sarcastic way, oh, well, who's surprised? The US, I'm like, no, this is actually surprising and this is actually shocking because yes, the US does tend to violate international law, but if you compare something like this to, say, their attempts in Iraq, right, where yeah, sure, it was fabricated and it was weird, but they were kind of trying to justify themselves in the framework of international law. This is just like, we don't care. We're going to just do whatever we want, and we are not even going to vaguely reference the legal framework anymore. That's very alarming.
Right. And just to come in on that, I mean, this was a theme in our end of year episode, and I'm not sure we quite got to the heart of it, which is, what's the difference between not caring about the rules at all, between following the rules strictly and acting in contravention to the rules, but trying to find a justification for your action anyway. Now, that middle ground for a lot of people will just seem like it's something cynical or, it's a cover on naked power or whatever. But for those of us who still believe, to whatever precarious extent, in an international system based on law, that is significant, right? Because you are not directly challenging or undermining the rules, and you are, in some sense, reaffirming the norm even while violating it.
Correct. Yeah.
And that helps preserve, however fragile, the underlying norm. If you go, oh no, we're not actually breaching another state's territory, territorial integrity, political independence, there's an exception, or we were invited by an exiled government, or this or that or the other. You're conceding that that baseline norm is important and should generally be respected. When you don't even talk in those terms, that's far worse. And hopefully that's a distinction listeners might get. But also in terms of just announcing things in this sort of, I don't know, least favorite uncle after 3 years at a barbecue kind of a way. Would it just be better if all the Palestinians left Palestine? This all, and you saying, how do you even as a lawyer start to come back at this? I mean, obviously this is part of the Trump MAGA style, right? You just, to use the horrible tech bro phrase, move fast and break things. And by the time everyone's explained why that's insane, you're either on to the next thing or you've shifted the window of what people are prepared to contemplate so far that you get something that was previously unthinkable anyway. But it also reminds me of what I understand on the internet is called Brandolini's law, which is that the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than the amount of energy required to produce it. Right?
Yes.
So explaining simply as a lawyer why this is legal nonsense is actually vastly time and energy consuming compared to the chaos that can be caused by just a series of off-the-cuff remarks.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, just to do a list version of things about this that would be unlawful, and then I want to get into the response from Palestine, because I think that's potentially important here as well. But so we've got unlawful annexation of territory, breach of the UN Charter. We've got the crime of aggression, individual Rome Statute crime. We've got potentially genocide here because you've got the forcible transfer of children and the commission of mental harm to the group, even if not physical harm. And as you say, depending on where you put these people, potentially conditions of life to bring about their destruction. And in fact, Heidi Matthews on Twitter made the point that in the context of what appears to be an ongoing genocide by Israel, that the forcible removal of this population would be a part of that genocide. So at least that's how I understand her point. And Heidi, please contact me if I'm getting you wrong. But so if you've already got a genocide that's ongoing and the US just comes in to help, well, they may not be committing genocide in and of themselves, but they're certainly aiding and abetting the commission of a genocide by Israel. So you've got that. You've got forcible deportation, forcible transfer. These are crimes as well. Like, it is a catalogue of some of the most serious crimes against humanity, war crimes that exist in international law. And then, of course, you've got the just outright use of force. He's talking about putting military boots on the ground as well. And so that's the one I wanted to just also flag, because I think one thing that's been perhaps left out of the conversation so far is that if the US decides to invade Palestine via Gaza, Palestine has a right of self-defense.
Yep.
And they have a right of self-defense, both individual and collective. There is nothing stopping other states sending their militaries in to kick the US out. And I mean, arguably, that's also the situation with Israel.
Right.
But there were perhaps more blurry lines around the events in Gaza, because, we've seen it articulated that, well, Hamas started it, right, with the events, the atrocities of October 7th. So whether they've got a right of self-defense or how that works, there's a lot of blurry lines.
Any credible claim that there need to be continuing military operations in Gaza to address an ongoing military threat from Hamas have well and truly passed by this point.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think this would just be a whole new kind of conflict. I think if the US was to send in its own troops, and I think that would potentially give rise to, these rights again, but I guess
so I mean, let me parse two things out of that.
Yeah.
I mean, the first is, there is obviously plenty of evidence that points to a conclusion of genocide. And there's a case ongoing at the ICJ, and a case which it is inconceivable that Israel will not be found to have breached the Genocide Convention, if only on the prohibition of incitement to genocide, right? Because you have cabinet members who use openly genocidal rhetoric who have faced no criminal sanction. So there is going to be, almost certainly, a finding that Israel has breached the Genocide Convention at that level. But then when it comes to the criminal part, obviously a lot of people may give us some blowback going, genocidal intent, it's very complex, blah, blah, blah. I don't care, because the same actions that could constitute genocide, if they're carried out according to a state plan without the intent to target a particular protected group, are still crimes against humanity, right? So again, part of my popular rhetoric point here is, there is internationally criminal conduct, however you parse it, at this point. And obviously, the genocide label has a lot attached to it symbolically, but crimes against humanity can do the same substantive work. And strictly, there is not a hierarchy of international crimes.
No, that's right. That was the point I wanted to make. Genocide and crimes against humanity sit side by side. There is not...
But for whatever reason, popular discourse always comes down to, the terms you'll hear people use are genocide, war crimes, and then maybe, as we've said, ethnic cleansing. Somehow crimes against humanity has never quite captured the popular imagination, but its essence is a widespread and systematic attack against a civilian population. And anyone who is not presently seeing that on the facts is basically engaged in a massive exercise of cognitive dissonance. I think I had a second point, but I've forgotten what it was.
I was talking about, where did we get into? The right of Palestinian self-defense and
Right,
collective self-defense.
collective self-defense. Yeah, and I mean, I think it's just interesting that we somehow just see now. I mean, it's sort of there even in Trump's remarks. Gaza is just a theatre for violence, right? You know, the idea that this sort of escalation would not somehow trigger further legal responses. I mean, again, could it be made legal? Yes, if you accept that Palestine is a state, that presently its government, however much you dislike it, is the Palestinian Authority. Could the Palestinian Authority invite US peacekeepers in? Yes, but that's plainly not what's being talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the thing. You can come up, and I think that's what a lot of Trump's aides are sort of trying to do in current discourse is retrofit this into sort of justify this and suggest that there might be ways that this could be legal. That being one of them. And a lot of the reports were like, oh, Hamas has agreed to talk to the US, sort of implying that this might be, if they agree to it, then it's fine. But that's not what Trump was saying at all.
Well, no, but I mean, look, and again, if you announce a mad idea and then get the diluted down version that could be fitted within the constraints of the law and then executed legally, and I'm not persuaded that's what's going to happen, that's not necessarily a bad outcome. I mean, I once spoke to a government legal advisor who was working for an administration in their country they didn't necessarily ideologically align with. And I kind of casually asked them, well, how does that work? And he said, well, often my job is just to say, okay, you want to achieve outcome X. Sure, you can do that in a way that breaks rules, alienates allies, and creates consequences for us down the line. Or if we move on to this track, I can get you to the same place through the rules. And sometimes that's the job of a government legal advisor. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But again, we'll just have to see if that's remotely on the cards here.
Yeah. And so that in terms of like the practical side of things, I guess there's two tracks to this conversation, right? The first is the impracticality of this idea, and the responses from other nations. And then the other one is,
well, if Jordan doesn't want a bar of it, which is the present position, it's not going to happen.
No, that's right. But then the other side of it is let's say they do somehow just go in and, I mean, it wouldn't work, but let's say they send troops in an attempt to get this plan happening. What are the legal ramifications? What enforcement tools do we have in our toolkit as international lawyers? And I guess, unfortunately, the answer there is not much, because, of course, the US is not a state party to the Rome Statute.
Well, so I mean, this is the question that I guess has sort of been put to me on social media is, somewhat naively an interlocutor asked in perfect good faith, have international lawyers ever contemplated a situation where international law appears helpless to prevent war crimes? And I cynically just kind of like started laughing, or maybe laughing uncontrollably, going, "Oh, my sweet summer child, I don't think we've talked about anything else since around 2001, 2003."
Yeah.
So, this is not a new challenge. Hegemons potentially acting outside the law, and also, but I think one of the disservices the existence of the International Criminal Court has done to international criminal law as a body of law is we kind of presume that if it's not in the International Criminal Court, it's not real, it's not happening. Okay, so at the end of the day, at the very least, every state party to the Geneva Conventions has universal jurisdiction to prosecute grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. They have universal jurisdiction to prosecute customary international law offences of war crimes or crimes against humanity. And they have both customary and treaty rights to prosecute genocide. Now, of that basket, I would think the one where you're going to find statutes on the books most readily would probably be the war crimes provisions, right? Mm-hmm. And so, again, is Donald Trump holidaying in Kenya going to be arrested on a war crimes warrant issued by, the High Court of Kenya? I rather doubt it, But the point, as you've made before, Juliette, is that international law is ultimately not self-executing, right? It is for states to step up. It is for states to say, this is illegal.
Yeah.
And not just illegal, criminal.
Yeah.
And if they're not prepared to do that, then those norms start to erode. And and we've seen this in the diplomatic space, and we've heard Imogen talk about this in relation to her project, where, quote unquote, the leaders of the free world retreat, other actors will enter that space and populate it with their preferred norms.
Yeah, absolutely. But you're right. Like there's this tendency to refer straight to the ICC, and if the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction, well, that's the end of the world. But this was never meant to be a regime where the ICC was your first port of call, right?
Right.
ICC is there as the backup, and there's plenty of countries around the world that do have these crimes on their statute books. And as you say, it's an exercise of universal jurisdiction. It's not. It's entirely possible, right? And depending on just how badly this went and just how offensively this was implemented, I don't see it as being an impossibility that a state would issue arrest warrants for Donald Trump. I
mean, the other thing is, and we'll just have to see how this fact scenario plays out. Like, it's obviously not going to happen as it's been announced. Nonetheless, as you've said, the machinery of administration around Trump will try and make it come up with the most plausible version of it that could happen in the existing international order. But the more immediate consequence is that I don't think there's a politer word for it, the unhinged elements of Israeli politics are going to take this as aid and comfort.
Yeah.
And there is definitely the risk for members of the Trump administration that morally or in terms of criminal responsibility, they become more closely tied to those people and their plans, and whatever shakes out of this that isn't what has directly been announced, if it continues the widespread and systematic attack on the civilian population that, in my view, is occurring, then are you aiding and abetting that process? And that could result in a much wider net of liability.
Yeah, absolutely, indeed. And I mean, the other thing, I mean, I'm not a Twale scholar, and this is not my area of specialty at all, but I think the other thing that's worth mentioning before we start to wrap up is that this is just so colonial, right? Like, it's so offensive, this idea that you would just waltz in to another country, regardless of any views of the indigenous inhabitants, and just do some stuff. And it's such a tragedy in respect to Palestine that this has just continually happened to the Palestinian people throughout their history.
Right.
And I think that's worth mentioning too. It doesn't necessarily fall into some legal framework, but it's this mentality of just being able to ignore the wishes of the people who live there.
Well, and you've just linked something in my mind as well, which is a key part of coloniality is to look at a map or to stand on terrain and see land that you should own, right? Yeah. Regardless of who is already there or what other previous claims are there. And then to see it as something that is presently undeveloped and should be developed. There's possibly no more colonial mindset available than that of a real estate developer.
Yeah, exactly. And that's it. Like, states are not real estate. You can't just come in and throw some money around and go, oh, I'm going to take that and I own it now and it's mine. This is not how it works.
This is not how the world works. But Greenland, the Panama Canal, Canada is the 51st state of America.
Right? Like, this is obviously just got this, you're right, this real estate developer mindset where I'll just come and take land and it will be mine. I mean, his language, even in the press conference, the US will own it.
Well, and also, as many others have already said, to some extent, whether it happens or not, this is potentially a massive green light to every territorially revisionist power anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
If changing borders by use of force is no longer a fundamental norm of the system, then all bets are off.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Well, on that depressing note, let's begin wrapping up. So, Juliette, what does the rest of your day look like?
Well, I was supposed to go see my personal trainer, but now I have to do other media interviews instead. So exercise exercise will have to give way to the prevailing insanity, I'm afraid. How about yourself?
Well, I've just done immediately before this a pitch to our new BA students in uniform here at the Australian Defence Force Academy. Oops, I must say that I'm not an employee of the Australian Defence Force Academy. I'm only a professor at UNSW Canberra. It's just that most of our students are members of the Australian Defence Force Academy. So anyway, meeting the new BAs is always interesting. And then the rest of the day, I am meant to be writing about the South China Sea dispute for my book. But frankly, China's somewhat revisionist attitude towards the law of the sea is seeming pretty small beer this morning.
Oh my goodness. And tomorrow will bring more shenanigans, no doubt.
Yes. So look, we're going to try not to do an emergency Trump cast every time madness is uttered from a White House podium, but where it does bear directly on questions of international law, we may from time to time jump in. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.